We are back, and we've seen, I think we've gotten a great sort of basis laid for the different issues of siting decisions, and we've heard the perspective of some experienced solar developer, and we've hinted at some of the ways that these decisions don't have to be an either or. So we're thrilled to have Lexie Hain from the Solar Grazing Association. Lexie is founder and executive director of American Solar Grazing, which is a not-for-profit dedicated to promoting best practices in solar grazing. She's also co-owner of Agrivoltaic Solutions, LLC, a business dedicated to using sheep for vegetation maintenance at solar arrays and vineyards in the Finger Lakes district of New York. Lexie has been a farm owner in New York State since 2005. She has a BS in Natural Resources General Studies at Cornell University and an MS in Environmental Sustainability from the University of Edinburgh. Yes, that Edinburgh, the one in Scotland. So Lexie, thanks for joining us.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. How's the sound?
Good.
Wonderful. It is a delight to be here today, and really a pleasure to be follow Audrey and Green Skies. I think that really lays out the foundation of the world I'm in on a regular basis, and the world that is very active, especially actually, across this nation. And so I'll give you a little perspective on kind of how I fell into this funny niche. And I'll say in two things. One, many of our universities, in particular our land grant universities, have, maybe have some land that they were given many years ago. And the Cornell University was awarded, chose to set zero emissions targets and started building ground-mounted solar. I think the first one was about 2014. And since then, in the Finger Lakes has built a number of arrays. The average size is about 14 or 15 acres. And what that meant is that there was this unofficial kind of research project that occurred because we all had that, people in the community and Cornell also kind of had to figure out what to do and how to manage these sites and what to do about the pollinators and how to build them properly and which land to pick. So that's the world I live in, and I do have a farm here in the Finger Lakes, very lucky. It's very beautiful here today, and my barn is getting worked on. And the other thing I'll say is how I got into this is I was working very hard on a community-owned wind project in our community that was defeated by local opposition after many, many years of hard work and entirely local funding and support from our state's Department of Energy and from Cornell University. So it kind of motivated me after that project failed to see what I could do to continue to support renewables and also to do something in farming. I had recently sold another business, so I wanted to do something. So and with that, I think I probably should start my talk. I only have half an hour. So let's, Mark, can you forward the slide, please? Okay, so especially in the Northeast, but anywhere there's rain, solar arrays do need regular vegetation maintenance. And without some thought to that, you very quickly will lose the entire purpose of that. And as you can see, as many of you know, there's native tree seed banks, there are birds, there are many ways in which tall things can suddenly grow up without attention to this detail. And what a shame that would be. So how to achieve that in a sustainable way. Next slide, please. So kind of what is solar grazing? And we've defined it as the practice of using livestock to manage vegetation under solar arrays. This particular array is at Princeton University in New Jersey. It is a single access tracker site. It has been managed entirely with sheep for 3 years and successfully by a New Jersey sheep farmer who is a full-time employed solar grazer. So pretty neat there. People ask, you know, which sheep, all sheep, some sheep. I'm not going to go too far down this road, but suffice it to say, pretty much all sheep should be able to work. My particular preference is to steer clear of sheep with horns, but there are people using sheep with horns for many years on solar sites without problems. Sheep have a, sort of this natural symbiosis, if you will, with solar, in that ground-mounted solar needs not a ton of modifications for the sheep to do a good job managing the vegetation. They have, my friend was saying that they're like Roombas with legs. And I do see that their natural behavior is gentle enough. They're not aggressive. They're not too curious. They don't rub too much. They're relatively tame. And there are many, many age-old systems for doing good grazing management to effectively manage the vegetation at these sites, which is of course the goal of the production. People ask about cattle. There are certainly opportunities to graze cattle at solar, but not most ground-mounted solar that we are talking about in this conversation. Those sites that do have cattle need to have their pole mount, or I would call them raised racking. You might think of them as carports. So that is the number one question I get, is about cattle. Sheep very nicely can handle almost all terrains and types of solar without much modification. Next slide, please. So one thing that's pretty neat about this is if you can think about this, conceptualize it as a layered system, which is how I like to imagine it. I credit this particular image from a German research institute. It's a private firm called Fraunhofer, but they do quite a number of studies that looks at things like percent efficiency and percent yields when you start laying the dual production of systems. I will be using the terms dual use, co-location, and agrivoltaic. I know you've already heard co-location once today. Thanks, Audrey. And the general idea, and I think perhaps particularly useful in a place like Connecticut with large population and high land prices, is this concept, is let's be as efficient as possible when we do use solar. Could I please have the next slide? So agrivoltaics, so part of what I should say is, you know, I spent several years traveling around this country and on the phone with people in Europe, at solar trade shows, and meeting people from Japan who were all doing, very interested in this dual use. And what was clear to me after a little while is that the sheep were sort of a natural fit that were already being deployed, that a practice that had emerged in a number of places, in Europe, in Florida, in North Carolina, in California, and were being used at scale. You know, that there's an array in California that's 3,500 acres, planned for grazing with endangered species, doing well on those sites. But in fact, the sheep are the ones that are kind of at scale working. There are many, many exciting areas of innovation here. And some of these are very planned, and that's where this solar saffron, which is part of the University of Vermont, and many solar vegetables, including UMass Stockbridge sites, University of Tucson at Greg Van Gafford's lab, Oregon State University. All of these universities are trying to figure out what it is that will work for farmers and farming with solar co-location. And there have been some pretty interesting things that have been discovered, especially in drier rangeland conditions, you're seeing increases in crop yields where crops are grown under solar or with solar. And you're seeing increases in grass production. And in Australia, you are seeing instances where farmers are able to be more successful because there's more grass in a drought year and they have more grazing available. So our National Renewable Energy Lab, NREL, has an Inspire working group and an Inspire portal that is tracking these disparate projects across the United States and the world. And so that is a publicly available information source that is something we can follow. And I'm sure you'll all be glad to know there's also solar grown coffee and solar grown matcha and things like that that they're playing with. Okay, next slide, please. So what makes the sheep the thing that have really been in practice in this case for almost 10 years in this country, over thousands of acres, are that they really just are they're the right size. These sheep are at it's an 18-acre solar array. They've been grazing using a rotational grazing plan at one of Cornell's arrays on a steep hill slope for, I think it's about 5 or 6 years now. And no modifications needed to the actual solar, which you can see is potentially pretty low to the ground there. Especially as solar gets lower and lower to the ground, the sheep do a much better job than their competitors. And we'll talk about that in a second. Next slide, please. So sheep work to control their vegetation across solar technologies. Solar is an incredibly busy business right now. It's one of those things where I think I was at the trade show last year and it's 20,000 people at a trade show and builds a capacity, and every year it's bigger and bigger. And this is an area with a lot of innovation, a lot of funding, a lot of research. There are, on the bottom right, you can see a solar tracker site. It's the middle of the day, so you can barely see the panels. On the top center of the site, that's a site in Pennsylvania. It is rotationally grazed. You can see the farmer actually stuck a bunch of fence posts up it, but that's a fixed tracking system or static, not moved. And anyway, so in the bottom left, that's another older tracker system because where it kind of looks like a ladder on its side. That's where all the cables are held together. That's a very hard site to use a conventional mowing system on. Next slide, please. So I actually just asked some engineers to help me quantify this. But I think the thing for the people of Connecticut to sort of think about here is the aesthetic they desire, or when you're thinking about policy and regulation. There is a stark difference between sites that are managed with sheep and managed well versus sites that are managed with, I call it the turf grass or golf course look. And this is something I just find that different solar companies have different standards around. And I will strongly encourage folks to allow something like this. You can see the vegetation starting to get high. It's not yet at 32 inches. And this is a fixed site. These don't move. But I want to be able to see that beautiful solar pasture or the solar meadow. I want to be able to see as much biodiversity growing there as possible. And I don't want to see something that looks like a lawn, and for a variety of reasons. So I should say that at the beginning I was asking about I was starting to reference that the reason I was talking to an engineer recently is there's even a little bit of shade does reduce the power production of the solar modules, but I don't know quite how much. So I recently called someone to say, is it the top of the grasses, if just a little bit of the tops of the seed heads are there peaking above, is that acceptable or not? And certainly I can see that when the clouds go over my solar arrays when I'm out on one of my sites, I could hear very slightly the little fans in the inverters shifting and down. So I do know they are very sensitive to this. Next slide, please. So here is my little turf grass demonstration. These are some pictures of some sites in North Carolina I was visiting. And again, since Connecticut seems to be in a phase of planning and being thoughtful about this, you know, I just would like to discourage what I see here. And if you look along that fence line, and yes, all these solar sites do need to be fenced, but that is an herbicide strip that you see. That's why that looks so brown. And if you look at the top right, that's erosion that comes from maintaining that site cut very, very, very short. So, you know, not a lot of, I say, agricultural community value here, and maybe some environmental side effects that we weren't really wanting. So thinking about that. Next slide. So sheep can do a great job. They should do a great job. And if you look on the right, this is sort of a famous picture. I did not take that. I pulled it off the internet. But what I find is apples to apples. The sheep, as you can see on the left, is right under the panels. On the right, there's a lot of vegetation growing there. Sheep do a great job at a place where most human beings would really struggle. You'd have to bend over. You're going to be wearing a hard hat. You might need a string trimmer to work for hours and hours. And so what I find is when sheep producers and solar grazers go and are trying to bid on solar sites for the purpose of solar grazing, we're often getting quoted against landscaping crews who are just mowing the open areas or the alleys. And that's something I don't like to see so much. But I do see it. I took over a solar site this year with my grazing business, and the site had been managed by landscapers for 4 years, and it didn't look too different from the picture on the right. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, Green Skies mentioned this a little bit, but you know, they were saying from a developer's perspective, it's great to have a site where you don't have to do a lot of site work. And by that, they mean, you know, of course, lots of work with heavy equipment. Increasingly, you know, it's more cost effective to build on sites that don't require lots of site work, and also not to do it for disturbance and compaction sake. So, the point here is that sheep, when you use sheep and use them, use them using rotational grazing. You don't, sheep don't throw rocks is the joke, but the rocks and debris that might strike the panel with a mower, that's not going to happen. You don't have people crouching under the panels, and you have reduced herbicide use or eliminated. You have fewer of the larger equipment driving around in the site. So overall, it should be lower operations and maintenance costs using the grazing. Next slide. So yes, and those are some of my sheep if you're curious. It is effective and something we can talk about a little bit, but it is compatible with pollinator projects and plantings. I saw one of the questions earlier about where does it stand with pollinator scorecards and so on and so forth. And I would say that you should work with the Center for Pollinators and Energy. They have been doing the pollinator scorecards in many states. And my comment is simply that please also keep in mind that grazing is a great way to balance both those needs. And because otherwise you will get trees. So you're gonna need some grazing and some pollinators. And the other thing to put here, and we'll get into it later, is this is a paid service, or the farmer needs to be paid for this. So in terms of agricultural value and use, this is not the typical model of where I might lease a pasture next door and pay to graze my sheep on it. Next slide, please. Sheep with brown field size. Okay. Back to the idea of land use efficiency. Study out of Wisconsin did show that basically solar and land production is sort of the most efficient use of land you can get if you're putting energy and meat together. It also this, and Renew Wisconsin has done a bunch of work on ethanol production as a land use, which is quite hard on the land and reasonably inefficient, which you're probably aware of. Next slide, please. So what I've seen across this country is that solar grazing does provide job opportunities. Increasingly, I'm seeing farmers who are really struggling in dairy or getting out of dairy or just struggling with just being commodity crop farmers and wanting to have a steady income. So they're either leasing some of their land or they're interested in the opportunity to get into this other business. And one thing that's sort of hard to see, but I've now seen over the years, is that there is job creation and maintaining rural jobs, which is a real challenge, as I'm sure you're aware, for a lot of rural communities right now. But that solar grazing does help with that, because there is a whole infrastructure around maintaining livestock on farms that this helps keep strong. Next slide, please. Okay, I'm going to give you some examples here of some people who are members of our solar grazing organization and some different ways in which solar grazing works for them. This is a small family farm in Pennsylvania. They're diversified. They already did grass-fed sheep. And for them, this is their second year. They have an arrangement with their local university, Susquehanna University. They bring the sheep there in the spring. They actually have a vet tech undergrad student who checks the flock every day for them. And they are able to bring in additional revenue by leasing the sheep out to the university every year. They are looking to do this on additional solar as Pennsylvania gets more solar. And they're interested in consulting as well, because there's, like many states, Pennsylvania is supposed to get a lot more solar, and there's only a few people who know how to do this right. Next slide, please. So this is the Solar Sheep LLC. My friend who does the grazing for Princeton, as well as across a number of other sites in New Jersey. This is a model that also could work for Connecticut, where someone is a full-time contract grazer. They have a home farm where they keep their sheep in the winter, because you do need a place for them in the winter. They need to be in a barn or outside a barn. And anyway, they need to have running water all winter long, and protection from wind is actually the most important thing. And she has made a full-time business of this, where she brings the sheep across the different solar sites in the spring. She rotationally grazes them, and she collects income from all the different solar companies every year and brings the sheep home in the fall. She also sells lamb, and we can get into this more, but there is there's a robust lamb market in the East Coast. Most of the lamb eaten in this country is imported. The American Lamb Board and the Lamb Resource Center have a lot of information on this and are very supportive of solar grazing. And so most of it is imported, and the rest of it is imported from the American West and Upper Midwest. So there's not nearly the producers there are for the markets here. Next slide, please. So this is my grazing business. Some pictures from one of our sites last year. You can kind of see the size and scale. This is a relatively hilly site. It was abandoned, and the upper picture just shows one day we were, I believe, collecting some sheep to bring them to another site or bring some home, and a truck and trailer set up there. The bottom left shows the actual collection of the sheep, because yes, you do need a way to get them again in the fall. The middle picture is me on a summer's day setting up some electronet, which is a portable fencing, to subdivide a newly leased a site we had just gotten a new contract on, and bringing the sheep to. You can see that low cabling that the sheep caused no trouble with, but everyone was worried, and it's totally fine. And I set up game cams and everything else, and it was just fine. And on the right, it just shows there's some sheep following me. And the point is, you have to be able to get the sheep from place to place. And, you know, some people use herding dogs, some people use grain. There's all kinds of techniques. Next slide. How do I deal? Oh, lots of good questions coming. How do I deal with sheep? Okay. Biometrics. Okay. So here's in Florida, there's a lot of solar grazing. And another neat business model here that this A+ Environmental Restoration uses. They're basically an ecological services firm that used to use livestock for conservation grazing in and around some of the sites in the Everglades. There's a similar business to this in Minnesota that has also gotten big into solar grazing. And so where it's the kind of things where livestock have lower impact in sort of ecologically sensitive places, and then solar grazing came along and they saw this as a good segue. So the point on this one is just, here's a solar site I was able to visit. It's 550 acres. And the sheep maintain 100% of the solar site. And in that case, all year long, because it's Florida and successfully. The wildlife questions for Connecticut are quite different from the wildlife questions in Florida, where I learned a lot about how copperheads like to go after all mammals. In Connecticut, we can talk about it, but basically you will need some good fences to keep your sheep safe, and I would guess it's largely from coyotes and from dogs. You can see in the photo right here, there's a nice sliding gate that does help keep the sheep safe. They are prey animals, and they can be unfortunate victims without a good fence. Next slide, please. I also know a few solar grazers who keep in the old school guardian dogs, or here a guardian donkey with their flock. Carolina Solar Service is another sort of emerging business opportunity. These are just a great firm that maintains a number of, I think it's like 55 solar sites in northern North Carolina. They're all community scale. Those numbers are actually no longer accurate, I'm sorry, on the services section. It's grown since then. And they do a comprehensive, so it's the electrical service work, all that maintenance. And then they also have the sheep, and then they also sell lamb. It's pretty neat. And they also work in Oregon, but maybe they'd consider Connecticut, I don't know. Next slide, please. And probably the oldest, I would do this subject injustice without mentioning Sunrise Farms. This is I think it's the oldest network of solar grazers in the country. They're in North Carolina. They've been working with farmers there for, I think, 8 years or better now. This is sort of their flagship solar site. It's called Montgomery. It is 450 acres. It is managed entirely with sheep. And if you look in the bottom right, you can actually see where there's a 70-acre portion where it's not solar, where they have another spot where they're able to move sheep if it's really wet, if there's a lot of rain, to deal with concerns about erosion. They also have a lambing barn on site and a full-time staff year-round to work with the sheep. They use guardian donkeys and guardian dogs, and it's a full-scale business. And the way they got into it is the wife went home to Norway and saw the solar grazing and came back and brought it here. Next slide, please. Oh, how long did the sheep stay on site? I can answer that while we're doing it, but in Connecticut, you'll expect that they will probably go home go back to a farm in the winter, or go to somewhere with you would need a way to probably bring them somewhere with a barn in the winter. Just you need a way to feed them, supplement winter feed, have some running water for them, and they need some wind and protection from the elements. But it could be built as part of a solar site. I wouldn't say you have to bring them back to a home farm. But I bring my sheep to solar sites here in upstate New York, usually in April or May. I rotate them around the solar sites, and I bring them home in October or November. Okay, so you can find a lot of information at solargrazing.org, including this study that talks more about the actual business numbers for the farmers, for the contract grazers who are engaged in this. You can also find out more about things like animal welfare and well-being, and basically the fact that the sheep do great on solar sites when they're managed properly. This study very quickly just says that for the size solar sites that New York had during the year of the study, so it's 2018-19 was published. So during 2018, the average was a little over $500 an acre of income for the farmers, and broke out some more of the economics. Unfortunately, there's not much more in the way of publicly available information than this particular study and report. There needs to be a lot more, and I will say that there's a need for getting that kind of thing funding, but it doesn't really exist yet. Next Next slide, please. So this is another angle on this that I was mentioning lamb, but here is, it's called value added if you're in the farming agricultural world. But what this is the idea that there are some folks looking ahead to saying, could there be added value with solar grown foods of various kind or solar farm to table? So just noting that there are people looking into this, and most of them are in the lamb business, but there are also, and I'm afraid those didn't come out very well, those links, but there are also people in the wool business looking at climate neutral and climate negative wool production. And there are people from California Fiber Shed doing that. There's also North Face famously doing that. And the other big set of inputs are coming from the Center for Pollinators and Energy and Solar Honey. That picture on the bottom right is some Solarama Crush beer. It is released annually. It is comes out of Minnesota, and a full-time solar beekeeper does supply all the honey for that. So there's definitely a market evolving for these products. And does solar, and next slide, please. Does solar sites need water? Yeah, I'm going to get into some planning and some mechanics. This talks a little bit about indirect benefits to the ag economy, both setting up and operating solar sites as pastures, whether they're on your home farm or whether they're a network of solar sites that someone like me or here Julie is working from, does have real costs, and so therefore supports an agricultural economy. Everything from your large animal vets, the income to the farmer, the winter housing for the sheep, feed, and then you have all of the things that regular operating farms need funding for. And then we have, and then as I know, it's increasingly look at trucks and trailers, labor and equipment to move sheep to and from the solar sites. The other part, and I think I'll get into this a little bit in a minute, is you will need people like NRCS or Extension Services to help plan the grazing at solar sites and support them. And the picture on the bottom left is a seed that the folks here at ASGA, people at Cornell, and Ernst Pollinator Services designed for solar sites. It is meant to be pollinator friendly, grazing friendly, and solar friendly. It is called Fuzz and Buzz. It is currently being installed on about 400 acres of solar sites in Pennsylvania this year, but we're looking forward to seeing that into practice. And again, that's an opportunity for a seed company to work and refine and tweak that. Oh, how does it benefit veterinarians? Because next, we're running a bit late. Next slide. How much time do I have? Okay, this is the Atkinson Center slide. Let's go to this is the quick thing here is income to the farmer is direct. The farmer who is the solar grazer is the top left. I was saying in New York, it's $500 and some an acre. And most of the sites in that were the size sites you'd be looking at, Connecticut, less than 100 acres sites. Subcontracted means the farmer was working for a landscaping firm. And there are some advantages to that sometimes. So you lose a couple $100 an acre for that. Next slide, please. So a veterinarian, just to quickly answer that, the veterinarians, shouldn't try and quickly answer questions. You're grazing usually 3 to 4 sheep per acre. And so you need a veterinarian because, for health and welfare checks and for all the reasons you might need them if you're usually operating livestock. So this is a map that I've made based on many phone calls with people in different parts of the country where solar grazing is happening. And green is where I know it's happening. And the peachy color is places I anticipate it's going to start this year. Next slide. On our website, you can kind of see a system we've started to launch, which is a solar and sheep mapping tool. We actually just just launched it and we're just retooling it, but it looks a little bit, it's a very fancy little app that we've designed to help match farmers with solar sites so they can find each other easily, because it is not always simple. Okay, some take-home strategies to promote. I will encourage planning for Connecticut. I can try and follow up later with a list of things that I would encourage Connecticut people do if they're interested in solar grazing. Next slide. But I do think some planning will really reward all of you. What Massachusetts did next door is somewhat helpful. They have an adder that helps developers compensate them for some of their time if they're going to modify sites to account for agriculture. However, that is a pretty limited system. They've taken steps in the right direction, but it actually doesn't do nearly enough for farmers. Next slide. And you can find sample contracts on our website for farmers and for solar developers to use as a template for solar grazing. It's pretty comprehensive, and I think it could be a good way also as an integrated tool. Next slide. And with thanks to Pace University, Elizabeth Hobbs School of Law for that as well. Just a thing to think about, because I said that Massachusetts had done one thing. This is another thing that our county looked at, but then it was eventually rejected, and I have seen it in other places, which is having tax benefits for continued for agricultural use at solar site would be another thing that I would like to see. I really can't stress enough that I would like to see strategies to support ongoing co-location. So not just sheep that are, a sheep we're planning for solar grazing, but it didn't really work out. And now we're just going to hire landscapers. I want to see ongoing strategies where farmers get contracts for 20, 25 years, and they have that certainty and they have that planning, and they know that investing in 500 sheep is going to be worth it, and the infrastructure that surrounds that. So that's my big take home for you all, is making sure that this is something that's both planned for, but also ongoing. So it is a real and material difference to your rural communities. Next slide. Probably almost done. Cut me off if you need to. Yeah, cut me off. It's okay. There's some insurance stuff. It's kind of dull. Keep going. Next slide. Okay. Last thing, when we can all travel again, or actually just put into these researchers this morning to find out if they're going to start offering virtual tours. There's a great study happening at Cornell. This is his first full year, but it is grazing sheep on a solar array. And this one's a 58-acre site to optimize pollinator seeds, pollinator plant species, and sequester soil carbon. So there's 3 different departments that have come together. It is a really awesome study. It'll be the first of its kind that documents rotational grazing with sheep and sequestering soil carbon. So I'm really looking forward to that, and I will post any information about that on the solargrazing.org website as that comes through. Next. Am I almost done? Val, is it your turn? How much time do you have? 10 minutes?
I'm captivated.
Oh gosh. Anyway, the British have done a little bit. The Europeans have more. I just wanted to say there are some guidelines. Now remember, the climate in the United Kingdom is not the same as here, but there are 2 good practice guides. You can talk to folks. In particular, the guide on the right, I think, is a nice look at when you're building a solar site on an existing farm, and they talk about a couple different strategies. So I endorse that. And am I at the last slide? One more? Who knows? Val, you should just get them to put your slides up and keep going. Oh yeah, that was it. That was my into the sunset picture. You can go back if you want. But yes, this is something that happens when COVID is over. We'd love to have you all come and see solar grazing happen here and in other communities around the country. It is something that is well worth seeing, that is really happening, and to the benefit of many people. Thank you so much for having me, and I'll be available for questions afterwards.